Hello and welcome to my talk at the DevOps Days Canada. I will talk about the journey to DevOps maturity, a never-ending story, and hopefully you guys will enjoy the next half hour with myself. I'm Mirco, and I will share with you a little bit about my thoughts about DevOps maturity and how this fits into the overall transformation journey. So just a little bit about myself. So my name is Mirco, and I work in complicated environments. Right. So that means in general, I work with a lot of legacy applications. I work with large organizations that have hundreds of applications that they're moving into the cloud and where they're adopting DevOps and Agile for. In my day-to-day, I'm the global DevOps lead for Accenture, and I do share what I've learned in my projects and my consulting experience on my blog, Not a Factory Anymore. And I've also written a book, DevOps for the Modern Enterprise. So if you like what you hear, there's more to be found either on the blog post or in the book. So without further ado, let's jump in. And the very first thing that I want to just quickly touch on is there's a lot of talk about DevOps transformation, agile transformation, digital transformation. And I just want to touch on a few things here on the key principles. Because when we talk about transformation, when I joined the IT industry 20 years ago, there was this very simple process where to do a transformation, you determine what the to-be model is, you look at what your current as is, and then you determine the path to get there. And that model, many people are still applying, even though it's not actually accurate, because we have challenges understanding what our current situation is. The to-be keeps evolving, right? There's new ideas, new techniques, new practices coming up all the time. And that means the actual transformation in the middle is not something that you can lay out on a path. It's something that you have to find. And every step of the way, you need to course correct as you learn. And so part of the maturity journey is obviously figuring out, how do you do this? Like, how do you actually find your path in this very, very complex environment? So let's explore a couple of these concepts a little bit. So do we actually know our as is? And that will become quite critical as we talk about maturity assessments in a little bit. So here's a couple of examples that should make us think twice. So this is from 1990s out of a book around quality software management. And what they've done is they went to organizations and said, okay, here's 100 best practices for your industry. How many of them are you actually using in your day-to-day? Right? And they went to the vice president and they got 68% of the practices we are using. And they went to the director, went down to 58, went to the manager, slightly above 30. And they get to the engineer that is actually meant to be using these 100 practices, they're using 12. Now, that shows you just how difficult it is in an organization to understand what our situation is, because the vice president has a different view than the engineer. And that is not because management is dumb, or ignorant. It's because the situation is so complex. And I give you just a very simple example. Let's talk about continuous integration. If I ask an engineer, do you do continuous integration? They tend to give me a very detailed scenario when I go, we're doing continuous integration only on our feature branches, and we're only doing it for these three teams. Right? As you get to the team leads and to the next level up and the next level up, and you ask them, are you doing continuous integration? They will have hundreds of different contextual situations. They can't say easily what the situation is. So it's either they say, yep, I hear a lot of people talking about continuous integration, we must be doing it. Yeah. And so information as it transcends the organization gets tailored, not with any bad intentions, but just because the situation is so complex. Now that's obviously from the 1990s, and perhaps we've gotten better at this. Well, this is out of the 2018 State of DevOps report, and they looked at a bunch of different DevOps criteria, right? And so 15 criteria, and you see again between the C-suite and the engineer, there's a significant difference in how many of these best DevOps practices they think they have adopted. And then we can go one more further. Sorry, I'm just going to try to see that I can get this down. Yep. This is from the Accelerate report, and they ask, are you using the cloud? Yeah, and 67% say, yes, we're using the cloud. If you ask them, are they using it according to the 5 standards that the National Institute for Standards has defined? then that falls down to 22%, right? And those are things like, is it possible for you to, for your engineers to spin up a cloud instance without having to request something through, email or ticket or whatever, right? Just through an API call. And are you actually only using the environments and they're actually in use and you're turning them off otherwise? Like you're using the elasticity of the cloud. And that falls down to 22%. Now, that means, and this is a state of DevOps report, that means the people who actually respond to this are the people who are already interested in DevOps. Yeah, so it's not your average IT person, it's the people that are actually interested in it. And even those, you have these huge differences between understanding of the situation for where they are or where they think they are. Okay, so what about the actual transformation then? Now, as I said, that we used to have this idea that there's a to-be state, and the stable state, the end state. And I will be honest, I have not seen an organization reach an end state because things keep evolving. And so that means the end state keeps moving away from them. And it's actually even a little bit worse because when you go into these transformation, and there might be 3 to 5 year transformations, as they're getting to the end of it, there's a lot of exhaustion in the organization. There's money, a lot of money was spent, and they say, well, now we've done this transformation, we're done here. Now we start looking at cost, and we're starting at perhaps getting rid of some of the very expensive people that you had involved in the transformation. And what then happens is this, right? You have this cost reduction cycle until you get to the point where business is unhappy. During that time, you've accrued additional technical debt, and then you need to do the whole thing again. Yeah, and that used to work in the past where these cycles are 3 to 5 years. And that's basically, a generation of software that you had in between. But nowadays, you don't have that time anymore. And you don't have 3 to 5 years, because in that time, a digital bank might have taken all your customers away from your traditional bank, or any other digital disruptor has taken your business away. So we can't afford these long cycles. They used to work, but at the speed that we are now talking, this is just not sustainable anymore. So we need to have a different transformational model. And what that really means is, well, how can we rethink transformation? And I want to give you one more thought around this. And the model that I described earlier on, we had this to be, this as is, and the transformation in the middle. And the question is, could it even have worked? And then for me, it was, for a while, I said, perhaps it was possible that this worked. Like an agile was just a response to the changing environment. But here's the interesting thought process. There's a couple of different gaps that we always have in all transformation, that we now have it more than ever. So we want to achieve a certain outcome, right? We want to be the best IT shop. We want to be cloud native. We want to have the most efficient way of delivering features for our business. The first thing is we need to understand, so what do we need to get done, right? And there's this knowledge gap that we're building these plans when we ultimately have the least amount of knowledge, right? Because we only, as we start doing things, will we understand what is happening. So we're building a plan based on the knowledge we have. And there's always a gap. So it means any plan we come up with can't be perfect. But having more knowledge there's always going to be that gap until we do something. So we have plans that are based on a knowledge gap. Now, the plans are created by some people, but not necessarily everyone. So, or there's a different understanding to the plan that I described to my colleague. What he will implement is his interpretation of my plan, not necessarily exactly my plan. So there's going to be a gap between the implementation and the plan. And in old waterfall, that's even worse, because you had solution architects or BAs up front that define something, they hand it over to the development team, they hand it over to the testing team. And in between all that, there's a lot of action gaps. And then we get to even if we had the perfect plan, which we don't, because we have a knowledge gap, even if we had executed it perfectly, which we won't because there's an interpretation gap, then will these things actually achieve the outcome? And that has so many other factors, from the environment, your competitors, the IT systems, that we can't actually predict the outcomes. So this cycle has 3 different types of gaps. That means we can only ever feel ourselves and sense ourselves to the result. It means we need to learn. And that means we need to have these cycles as quick as possible. You can ultimately overlay here a Deming cycle, and you can see this in the PDCA. to see how you can improve this over time, right? So even if we had all the information, if we had the right intentions, these three gaps would have caused us problems. So what can we do about that? Well, this is how the new transformation cycle really needs to look like. And that means we need to have a compass that tells us at the end of our first big step of our transformation to DevOps, to Agile, whatever we want to call it, we need to be able to see if everything that we are changing makes it better or not, or if just being more relaxed and perhaps taking the pedal off the gas, it takes us a little bit back. Yeah, and at the very end of the talk, I will provide a little balanced scorecard that I use for that in my project. But the idea here is really, how do we keep this going forward? And that's the equivalent of, I always take the example from a medical doctor, right? If a slightly overweight, high blood pressure, male in his middle age, like myself, goes to the doctor, what we're looking for from the doctor is that he will tell us, well, I can solve your problems by you taking this one pill. That would be exactly the answer we want. Right? And that's the equivalent of, here's the one transformation, or here's the one tool to install, the one DevOps tool, the one agile methodology. But the reality is that's not what the doctor's going to tell me. What the doctor's going to tell me is, Mr. Herring, I think you need to eat healthier, drink less alcohol, and exercise more, right? And you don't need to do this for the next month or the next 6 months. You need to do it for the rest of your life. That way you will lead a healthy life. And that's what this transformation approach really is. Like, there's not a transformation. It's just from here onwards, you need to be a learning and improving organization. Yeah, and this initial transformational energy that you bring into it needs to become a sustainable energy in your organization to keep moving forward. You need to become a learning, sensing, and improving organization. And that is really hard because there's no finite budget that you can give to this. There's no end line. There's no finishing line that you need to just drag yourself over and then magic happens. It is going to be an ongoing process. Yeah, and that is something very hard to sell to executives, but it's an incredibly rewarding journey because you keep finding new things that you can improve, and there's new tools coming out all the time, new technical patterns, and we really want to co-evolve with them if we can. So that is the overall transformation model to give you to have that in the back of your head as we're now talking about maturity more specifically. And one more warning perhaps on this, and I know we're trying to achieve the right thing, but what I see so often that we fall, and if you think about the maturity model, they all have on the very right-hand side, if you have 1 to 5, they have this level 5, and that's the equivalent of the Netflix and Amazons of the world. And what that equivalent is I go to my doctor, I'm not terribly healthy and not terribly fit, and I go there and say, hey, I have seen exercise videos from Usain Bolt. I think this guy is fit, so I'm just going to start doing the exercise that this guy does. That's the exact equivalent of a CIO going to the Silicon Valley, coming back home and saying, I need microservices and Docker, right? Because if your organization is not ready for that, if I'm not fit enough to do these exercises, then I'm going to hurt myself instead of actually getting better, right? And so we need to really, maturity is an incremental process. It's not, if I'm maturity 1, I want to jump immediately to 5. It's like, I need to get through 2, 3, 4 to get to 5, because there's learnings along the way. I'm kind of, to stay with the metaphor, I need to build my body up to actually be able to exercise at that level that, Usain Bolt exercises. And I'll never get there, but you get the gist, right? And obviously that will avoid the cycles afterwards. So that means maturity models can help, right? Or can say. And here's a very interesting thing to consider. Now, I'm not sure whether you guys have heard about the Dunning-Kruger effect, but Dunning-Kruger is fascinating because what it says is, if you don't know a lot about a certain area, as you learn a little bit, you actually believe that you know a lot. Yeah, and here's the obligatory Dilbert cartoon, and at the bottom you can see a couple of these examples, right? When you ask people of how they rate the academic performance, 87% of students say that they're above the median. obviously that's not possible, right? And the same is true when you look for, when you look at the faculty. So it's not just students, but the same is actually true for professors. Yeah. So similarly, if I ask someone, how well are you doing with DevOps? It's not uncommon that the organizations that are actually not terribly good tell me that, yeah, we are doing the DevOps. Right? We have DevOps the bejesus out of stuff, right? So you really need to be careful about it. And it's not, again, it's not bad intention. It's a very natural process. Psychology is very well researched. And that obviously causes a problem when we do maturity assessments, because when you ask people, do you do continuous integration? It's not uncommon to get an answer like, well, we're using Jenkins. So yeah, we're doing continuous integration. But there are alternatives to this. Yeah. And here's something that I picked up on one day. So I was working for a large complex client, and I was thinking about how do we solve this? We have, a couple of thousand developers. They work in their individual teams, and we need to understand and guide them a little bit on this DevOps journey. And something that I learned in university came back to me. Something that I spent a lot of time in university on was, well, let's be honest, playing computer games. And one of the games that I played a lot of was Civilization. And in Civilization, you had this idea of a technology tree. And in a technology tree, what you're saying is that there are certain things that you want to develop that requires multiple things before that. Yeah, and so here you see, like, before I can start developing literature, I need to have the alphabet. To have the alphabet, I need to have writing. Very similar, if you want to do continuous delivery, you need to have automated tests, you need to have automated builds, you need to have mature environments. So we created a technology tree for continuous delivery. Here on the very right, you see continuous delivery. And on the left, you see all the other things that are related to that. Build practices, unit testing, configuration management, there's a bit around feature toggling, deployment practices, et cetera, et cetera. And what that means is that each team can ultimately choose their own maturity adventure, right? Because there's not one way of starting this. You can start anywhere in this tree, as long as you are considering the dependencies. So as long as you know that you have the underlying practice, you can then kind of lift yourself up to the next level for that specific area. And that's, again, very like the exercising regime that we spoke about earlier, right? Once I can start walking for 2 kilometers, I can perhaps start doing some jogging, and then at some stage I can do some running, and at some stage I can do some can do triathlon, and can do and I can develop my cycling and my running and my swimming independently. Very similar, you can do this for this, and there's no need for everyone in the organization to take the same steps at the same time. There are certain practices, and they are highlighted here in yellow, where we do want to align. We do want to have a common mechanism for configuration management, so that I have a dependency against another team, then we need to be able to talk about the specific versions that we have, and they should be in a common mechanism, so that I know if I need their version 3, how to get it and how to deploy it into my environments to test against it. Yeah, but apart from that, you can actually evolve this relatively independently. And that became quite a powerful thing that we've used in quite a few organizations. Certainly here in Australia, you can see quite a couple of organizations using this model now. And it keeps evolving. It's something that you can have your own organizational flavor of it, but it's certainly something that is a bit more individual and a bit more contextual than a maturity model that has 5 dimensions from 1 to 5. The typical CMMI type maturity model. And then you can take it even easier, right? You can look at an executive version. Yeah, and I like this because I work with a lot of very senior delivery guys, and even if I put a diagram they get in front of them, it's still relatively complex. But there's these 4 questions I said. If you ask your team these things, you will learn a lot about your actually DevOps maturity. So the first one is, let's blow away the environment and rebuild it from our stored configuration. Yeah, and you just have to threaten that as a question, because you can see it in the other person's eyes, whether or not they're confident that everything is configuration managed, that it's easy to rebuild an environment. Yeah, I had in my earlier career, I did this, but on my own, under the assumption that everything was fine. And I spent 2 weeks just going through all the bits and bobs that were missing to rebuild the environment. But once I had that, I obviously formalized it, and then we could do that every night or every week, whatever it is. But that's a good check for how good your configuration management is and how good your environment standard procedure is, right? And then the next one is, let's delete the application config and redeploy it. So rather than just deploying on top of an environment, which is what often is done, say, no, let's just clean it out and put it in again. Right? Again, shouldn't cause a problem, but very often you find certain, I was working a lot with mainframe, certain components, certain copybooks only exist in production. Yeah. And so if you don't blow them away at some stage and try to rebuild from scratch, you don't know whether any of these things are missing. And you better do this in a secure situation where you have a backup somewhere than it happens to you by mistake in production or something like that. Yeah. The third one, and this is kind of key to continuous delivery in my perspective, is let's redeploy the application even though nothing has changed. When we talk about organizations that do hundreds and hundreds of deployments a day, they don't always change things. Like very often they just redeploy the same application. There might be a comment that has changed or some dark code that gets deployed for some later features. But so many organizations are risk averse and say, no, if it hasn't changed, I'm not going to redeploy it because who knows what will happen. That's exactly the wrong way to think about it. If you're mature enough, you should be able to redeploy and don't feel anything. Yeah, so that's a good check for how good your application deployment is, and to some degree, how good your regression testing is. And then the last one is really around testing. And to me, there's a lot of things that go wrong with automated testing. And one thing to test is whether you have a relatively mature test automation is, well, let's run testing. And then immediately when it's completed, let's say, okay, let's test it again. Let's run it again. Because so often the test data is not automated. So often the performance is not there. So often there's lingering processes running. And really what I want to get to is you should be able to execute your regression tree at any point in time. There should be no overlap with any manual testing. You shouldn't have any impact on the systems or on other things happening in the environment. And only then do you have a mature test automation suite. So that's kind of the executive version. And you can see how where we started with like transformation, where maturity is a defined thing on a 5-level scale, to the tech tree, to an executive version of just capabilities. And all of these are certain versions of maturity. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which one is the best one. It's what it works in your context. Yeah, what's your audience? The tech tree is something very much for the developers or for the agile teams. This is the executive version, and kind of the 5-level, 5-category CMMI type is really more from an executive. And there's a bunch of organizations that let you do their self-assessments online, and you can track it over time, et cetera, et cetera. And they're useful, but they're mostly useful for teams themselves as self-evaluation, right? None of these things are really super useful as an external assessment. So, I get asked, and I do work with organizations who want to understand their maturity, but there's a lot more to it than just a questionnaire. There's actually understanding the problems, and that's a completely different question and a different talk for another conference. So with that, I want to go into just a couple of aspects of where our maturity has brought us to, because I don't think we're sitting here now talking about continuous delivery as a mature practice, as something that we need to worry about. But there are things, as we've matured and we have figured out how to do continuous delivery, how to do cloud native development, that I think is still evolving. Yeah, and I want to just touch on 3 of them, because those are the 3 that all the big organizations that I work with are battling with. Yeah, and we haven't really, well, some of them don't have answers, some of them we just don't have good answers just yet. So the very first one is, how do we organize ourselves? And I see a real problem, because we all learned in our agile trainings or even our DevOps trainings that we shouldn't have silos. Yeah, we shouldn't have business, development, test, operations as different silos. Brilliant. I'm fully in agreement. However, the answer that agile teams by themselves solve that is not true. It's true that we have business, dev, test, ops in these agile teams, hopefully. But if they are operating as silos themselves, then we still haven't optimized the overall system. Right? We optimize for the system of the agile team, but we haven't optimized for the system of the organization. A system as the whole organization needs to have maintainability, needs to have platforms that are easily adoptable, where you can easily scale up and down. And that doesn't work if every agile team comes up with their own deployment mechanism, their own configuration management, their own cloud landing zone, their own Salesforce instance. So we do need to have some cohesion across that. And too many organizations took one type of silos and exchanged it with a different type of silos. And that's not super helpful. Similarly, it's the question around the DevOps team, right? So again, we have the agile teams in the middle. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. At the top, we need to have some level of governance, right? These might be your agile coaches, these might be your program directors, it might be your project managers, your product managers, whatever. And then at the bottom, people say, well, the agile teams should be able to do everything themselves, right? They should be able to fully run end to end. And the reality is they don't. And no team I know does that, because how many agile teams do you know that are actually taking a server and installing it in your data center? Not very many, I assume, because there's some team that is doing that for them. It's a cloud services team. That's the Amazon guys, the Azure guys, the Google guys, right? That's ultimately an external team. And is that different to an in-house infrastructure team that provides the same services if they would provide it at the same maturity? No. Problem is, many organizations, the infra services haven't caught up to it yet. Fine. And then the same is now true for DevOps services. You consume Azure DevOps as a service. And then again, is that different to having your organizational specific DevOps services? Probably not. And at some stage, you can fold all these things in, and you can run this as a tribe within in your agile teams. But honestly, lots of big organizations haven't really made that shift just yet. And then you have to solve, and this is a bit of a complicated diagram, but in these agile teams that are doing dev and ops, there's different types of work that you need to do. You need to do new change, which is very often Scrum-based, and you need to do production-based stuff, which is tickets and incidents that are pretty much Kanban-like, because you can't plan them in advance. So the teams that you can see here at the bottom, these agile DevOps teams, they need to deal with two different types of work. And I haven't found a lot of methodologies that really reflect that well. And the mechanism of how do you tune this up and down? How do you manage capacity between these two different types of work? So that's kind of an organizational challenge that we are still facing into these days. The second one is this coevolution that enables transformation. Yeah, and that to me is, we have the organizational aspect that we just spoke about. How do we organize our teams? We have the capabilities. That's your continuous delivery, your cloud native development, your microservices, your digital decoupling. And then you have the systems themselves, the architectures, the applications, the monoliths that we are breaking up. And the reality is those three gears need to evolve together. You can't just take one of them and put it all the way up to 11 and hope that the other ones will follow. You need to do a step in one, let the other catch up, and then pick up a next step either in the same or somewhere else, and then let everything else catch up again. So that you are co-evolving these three different dimensions of transformation. And too many organizations are still battling with just one of them, right? And that doesn't really achieve much, because you're getting stuck. The gears get stuck because the other ones are still slower, and the benefits are just not following at the same speed. And then the last one is culture. And here it's perhaps more cautionary tale than anything else, because the reality is there's so much dogmatic conversation out there. We touched on it earlier when I mentioned the DevOps teams, where people say, if you have a DevOps team, you don't get it, right? It's the same is true in the agile world, where people who follow one agile methodology believe that the other agile methodology is not real agile. Yeah, same is true for some of the tooling. Like if you use only a certain set of tools, then you're not as DevOps as others. And the reality is none of that is helpful. Like, we're trying to make progress in our organizations, and that takes so many different shapes. As long as we're knowing that we're moving forward, we are making progress. That's what matters. There's no purity. There's no one walking around giving you a badge for the most pure agile adoption or the most pure DevOps adoption. And any energy that you spend on that is actually wasted energy. Yeah. So be really careful when you get coaches in, or consultants or anyone else, or your own zealots inside the organization, that are basically saying that's not real agile, that's not real DevOps, because there's no real. It's only making progress, and we're all on this progressive journey through this together. So, as I said, I wanted to leave you with this kind of balanced scorecard, because I think that is something incredibly powerful. I use that in my projects, because there's not one metrics. I mean, if you look at the Accelerate book and the related research, there's a couple of key metrics that they have, and they're good. But I like to think of this as, depending on my context, certain metrics matter more than others, and certain metrics move faster than others. So I really want to look at this holistically. And these are the 4 dimensions. There's a couple of example metrics underneath, but the 4 dimensions is what matters. So we have business effectiveness. That's really what matters most to the organization, because that's how we attract customers, that's how we make money. And the idea here is we want to be able to experiment, and we want to be able to learn which experiments are good, so that we expand them, so that we get more and more customers into it, we get more and more products into it. Then we have delivery efficiency, and that is how quickly can we actually implement something. And to do that, we need to automate as much as possible. Yeah, so that's your typical cycle time, your deployment efficiencies, etc. Then we get to operations reliability, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how fast we can deliver something and how good the product is if it's unreliable. But if you get timeouts and errors, and that is the goal here, is again to automate, because we want to find as many of the errors ourselves rather than the user, and we want to be able to rectify them as quickly as possible. So we want to be able to react quickly, automatically, and without anyone noticing. And then we have architectural flexibility. And to me, that is really the countermeasure to technical debt. Like, how nimble are we in our architecture that we can evolve these bits independently? Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of different metrics around that. And if you look at those 4 together, and you can measure these for your organization, then you can see whether you're moving forward, because depending on which gear, remember those 3 gears you move, you will see these things improve differently. Right? And that should be really giving you the compass that we talked about earlier that guides your transformation. So I hope that gave you a bit of an insight, and I said it's a never-ending journey, and nothing really describes this better as there's no silver bullets. There's lots of snake oil out there of the one solution that will cure it all, and the answer is it won't. And the reality of this is that this looks a little bit like this, right? So you make early progress, and then you realize that things are not moving as fast anymore. And the real important thing for this transformation is to not give up, because once you're getting through this, you're going to find the next bit to do that actually moves you forward. And what makes it a little bit worse is that this is actually a repeating pattern, right? So you do that again and again and again. And that is that transformation lifecycle that I showed you earlier, that really demonstrates this learning, improving organization over time. Yeah, it's an incredible journey. I've been on this journey with many different organizations, and to me, it's just so enjoyable. Like I have fun in my work, because making progress, finding hard problems, solving them is just so much fun. Well, with that, I will leave you. If you want to get the slides, you can get them by sending a quick note. As a DevOps guy, I've obviously automated this process. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. Unfortunately, we couldn't have this event in person, so hopefully one day I will get the chance to visit you guys and talk to you in the floor, and answer questions and really exchange experiences. But for now, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and hopefully we find a way of connecting on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. So thank you very much.